Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominique Gomez, and I'm from the Salazar Center at Colorado State University. Welcome today for our conservation conversation. This is a unique collaboration of 9 university centers that is working to highlight solutions in climate, conservation, and environment. Before we get started, just a quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and we will share out a link to everyone who registered within the next few days. All attendees are on mute, so we can't hear you, but we would love to hear your questions. So you can submit those questions throughout today. We will have a moderated discussion at the end of the session today. Just use that GoToWebinar control panel and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. And lastly, at the last minute at the end of the hour, we will talk a little bit about our next webinar coming up, but you can learn more about the entire series at conservationconversations.org. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Emily Wakefield to take it away. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Dominique. Thank you so much and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Emily Wakefield. I'm a professor of history and director of environmental studies at Boise State University. And our panel is coming to you today from the smoky landscape around Boise, Idaho. And I want to acknowledge that this is the traditional lands of the Shoshone-Bannock and the Northern Paiute peoples, and to recognize and pay respect to their elders past and present. So please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today and form part of our conversation. I would also like to recognize a more immediate loss in our Boise State family, and that is of Dr. John Freemuth, who was on the organizing committee for the conservation conversations and who, had he not passed away suddenly in May, would likely have been the moderator for this panel. Many of you likely knew John and know how tremendous this loss is, not the least of which because he was such a vital advocate for and diplomat of conservation and also conversations that bridge academic and practitioner worlds. So what we would like to converse over today is transboundary conservation in a broadly North American context. We have 4 excellent speakers, so I will keep my own remarks very short so as to leave ample time for conversation. But there are several themes that animate these 4 brief talks. The first one is that there are many forms of boundaries that exist in conservation. There's political and military boundaries, there are private and public boundaries, there are species and ecosystem boundaries, and there are also socioeconomic boundaries that influence conservation greatly. Identifying these processes creates greater understanding of the management choices that are available to us. We also give these talks to allow the past and present to inform our focus on the future and to seek out mechanisms that exist and can be built for relational collaboration as we see them. So I invite you to question the speakers after they have talked or in the chat as they go along, and we'll take them collectively at the end. Our first speaker is Jody Brandt. And Dr. Jody Brandt is an associate professor of human and environmental systems at Boise State, and her overarching focus is to work with on-the-ground partners to improve natural resource management. Her current projects include farmland protection in the Boise metropolitan area and decisions for drought support for ranchers in Idaho and Montana. She's also partnering with tribes in the Great Lakes to restore culturally important wetlands. She focuses largely on teaching graduate students in advanced analytical techniques in the fields of landscape ecology, remote sensing, and socio-ecological systems. It's all yours, Jody.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Okay, and I think Dominique, if you can if you can share my screen.
Again, okay, let me try it again.
All right. Good.
Looks great, Jody.
That looks good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the private-public land border. And I thought that we would just start with a map of public and private lands in the US. And the public lands are the lands in different colors, and the private lands are the white lands. And so what jumps out, of course, is the predominance of public lands in the West. And if you're looking at the West and you look at those white spaces between the colored spaces, that's the private lands. And what's really striking is that what a small footprint the private lands have in the West. And so now let's look at another map. This is a map of human population change from 2010 to 2018. And the blue areas are areas that are increasing in population, and red are areas that are decreasing in population. And here too, the West stands out because the majority of the counties have a growing human population. So these two maps put together show the basic situation that we have here in the West, which is a trend of growing population. But where that growth occurs is somewhat constrained by public land ownership. So now let's zoom in and look at what this looks like on a local scale. And so here we have an animation of the growth of the urban footprint. That's the blue area in Boise, Idaho, from about 1950 to 2100. And the past dates are actual change that has occurred. And those patterns of past change allowed us to project how much growth would occur in the future and predict where that growth is most likely to occur. So what we find in a nutshell is that Boise has always been growing, just like many other places in the West. And we can also see that where that growth occurs is very predictable, just simply because it is quite constrained to private lands. And that these private lands can frequently be agricultural land. So this brings me to kind of my first policy recommendation or main point, which is there really is an urgent need for strong land use policies that consider multiple dimensions, including affordable housing, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. Okay, so now let's think about the importance of private land specifically for biodiversity conservation. And this photo is from a rural part of Idaho. This is Lemhi County in central Idaho. And this is part of what we call the High Divide or the Great Divide. And it's a key migratory route between the Greater Yellowstone and the Crown of the Continent ecosystems. And what we see is in the left-hand portion of the photo and in the back in those upland areas, those are the public lands. What's in the rest of the photo, like the center part, those are the private lands. And they're what we call working lands, which are parcels of privately owned ranches and farms. Now, I just want you to take like 5 seconds to think about this question. What are the main differences that you see in this picture between the private lands and the public lands? I think if we were in person, I'd ask you just to shout out your observations, but in absence of that, I'll just go ahead and synthesize or summarize what most people usually say, which is that basically the ecosystems are completely different. And in particular, the private lands kind of have the wet green ecosystems, and the public lands are generally lacking in that. They're mostly sagebrush and the uplands, the grasslands. And so this is important because up to 80% of wildlife species depend on music resources for some portion of their life cycle. And so this leads me to kind of the policy recommendation number 2. You know, if we want to kind of protect a variety of these iconic species that we really care about, we urgently need more protections and more landowner programs focused on music ecosystems, which occur disproportionately on private lands. And then this is my last point here. Let's think about how private land protection that has been enacted to date, how does that contribute to connectivity goals? So we have all of these wildlife who need large landscapes in order to thrive and survive. And we have really been invested literally millions of dollars in a variety of private land protection mechanisms, agricultural easements being one example. And an easement is a private land protection mechanism whereby a landowner keeps ownership of the land, usually that's in farmland or ranch land, but they give away or they sell that right to develop the land. And so it stays in a less developed type of land use. So based on the body of research out there about how private land conservation to date has, what the contribution has been to connectivity, I would kind of describe it in this way. So what we're going for is to protect land in such a way so you have this, kind of barrier-free pathway for wildlife to move. What we're trying to avoid is a scenario like this where development creates kind of this impenetrable barrier for wildlife. And what this shows is what, for the most part, and what we're likely really getting with private land conservation to date. So we're avoiding, this wholesale conversion of the land. But since land protection is often done kind of opportunistically and on a parcel by parcel basis, we still are creating a landscape. It is permeable, but it's much more difficult than the ideal for wildlife to move through. So this brings me to my last policy recommendation, which would be, more targeted protection and placement would have better outcomes, certainly for connectivity, and this likely extends to a wide variety of ecosystem services that we get from private lands. So just summarizing here the three main recommendations with regards to the private-public land border. The first one is that human population will continue to flow into the Western US, and we can predict with good certainty where that growth will occur. We really urgently need strong land use policies that consider multiple dimensions: our economy, affordable housing, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. Second, music systems are the lifeblood of the land in the Western US, and they occur disproportionately on private lands. And we really need better protections and policy initiatives that focus on music resource protection. And then finally, there is a lot of activity in terms of private land conservation, including easements and land use zoning, and a more systematic and targeted system for placement of private land protection would really give us more bang for our buck. And that concludes mine, and so I'm going to hand it over to the next presenter.
I'll go ahead and introduce our next presenter, who is Rocky Barker, a longtime environmental journalist with the Idaho Statesman here in Boise, now retired, but also the author of Saving All the Parts, Reconciling Economics and the Endangered Species Act, and also Scorched Earth, How the Fires of Yellowstone Changed America. He was part of a team of reporters who were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, and he has been covering the caribou, which we're about to hear more about, for more than 30 years.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate this opportunity. Does everybody hear me okay? Good. When I first started covering caribou, Idaho had put together this absolutely wonderful conservation program. They had introduced about 70 caribou up into the Selkirk Mountains, which is up in the border area, right next, actually it runs over the border into British Columbia. And while at that time there was a very healthy population of caribou, of these woodland caribou that lived on the Canadian side, but they didn't have a sustainable population living on the Idaho side. So the answer was simply, at the time, let's protect the habitat and let's reintroduce some individuals and let's build on conservation in a traditional way that we've done conservation all over. But the underlying power was the Endangered Species Act, and that act requires the federal government they shall take every action they can do to keep a species from going extinct. And so a lot of the habitat up in the Selkirk Mountains and in the cabinets next door and some other small ranges nearby were caribou habitat. Caribou, they basically have these big giant hoofs that they can use for walking on the snow, and they eat the lichens that grows on hemlock. And so this hemlock is old, it's really old growth forest. So it's, the simple answer is that it can't be logged. And the problem is when areas of it are logged, that changes the entire ecosystem, because things like mountain lions and now wolves and other predators are able to get up into that high mountain area where in the winter the caribou live, and they can prey on them. Previously, the problem was, motorcycles were getting up into the area, and snowmobiles. And of course, they were logging old growth timber in the United States. Now, they aren't logging very much old growth timber up in that area anymore. They've protected that habitat, but the numbers, they reached, they never got back up to the 70 that they reintroduced. But as late as 2009, there were about 46, and the population was growing in the US. But a couple of packs of wolves started preying on them when they were in British Columbia, and the government of Canada started shooting the wolves from the air. But they then were getting protests from people who didn't like them shooting the wolves. But the real issue was the habitat in Canada in particular has been steadily fragmented and harvested over the last 30 years. I've watched, you can drive up all over southern British Columbia, and you find clear-cut old growth timber. And that was the home of the caribou. In fact, today there's only 1,200 woodland caribou left in British Columbia. So it's not like they've got a whole lot of the species. So what happened here was a case of two countries with two different interests, two different outcomes. We really were trying, using the Endangered Species Act, to save this species, and their driving force was to increase the timber harvest, and they care a whole lot about rural development in Canada, much more than we do. And they were spending their money on that, and they had not found a way to keep the caribou habitat from being fragmented. So here, in February of 2019, the last two caribou were taken out of Idaho and taken to up into Canada, into a pen where they were let go in another population that lived further north. And it was, I interviewed, I'm a journalist, so I interviewed the biologist who had spent his entire career trying to save these amazing animals. And, he was in tears. It was the loss of a native species in Idaho. So I kind of look at this as a perfect example of two things. One, species like caribou, grizzly bears, big giant species that need large areas of habitat, you got to be looking at that habitat not just about what the borders are. It's not just what's private, what's public, it's what's habitat, and then can you protect it. Are you committed to protecting it, not just on one side of the border, but on two? And three, the Kalispell Indians got involved late in the process and were really committed. And I think that had they gotten involved earlier, and if the Native peoples of Canada gotten involved earlier, that might have been significant. So when I look across, my recommendations are: one, we need big space. Two, we really need a commitment out of both sides of the borders. And three, we need to use to the best extent possible the native tribes who have lived in these areas. So thank you very much. Do we have my next speaker, I guess, coming?
Thank you, Rocky. Yes, let's see. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Morado, who is an assistant professor in the School of Public Service at Boise State University. She teaches global studies and environmental studies in both of these programs, and she is trained as an anthropologist. Her research interests include environmental justice and inclusive conservation, and she's recently published a monograph based on her fieldwork, of which we're about to hear a piece, at the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge in Arizona. The book, Immigration, Environment, and Security on the U.S.-Mexico Border, explores the coevolution of conservation and militarization in the U.S.-Mexico border region. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Emily. And can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay,
And
great.
Lisa, if you just want to swap the display settings, we see your slides great, but they're on the presenter view, upper left.
There
we go. Oh, yep.
Change the webcam preference?
No, they're in display settings. There we go, right there. It should be presenter, swap display, presenter versus slideshow. And if not, it's not a big deal.
We could also, I could have Emily share my slides is another option.
Sure. Emily, do you want to do that?
How's that?
Just try swap. There we go. Looks great. Perfect.
All right. And can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry for those technical difficulties. Thank you, Jody and Rocky, for those really interesting presentations. I think what I wanted to present today connects to both of those talks. One, we are looking at a case of a federal land management, and then like Rocky, I'm looking at endangered species conservation across an international border. So what I wanted to present today is a challenge to transborder conservation, and we're going to look at a specific part of the American West. Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge is in southern Arizona, and as you can see from the slide I have, the southern border of the wildlife refuge runs along the U.S.-Mexico border. And so this wildlife refuge really finds itself at a crossroads right now, and has to manage multiple challenges to conservation. So endangered species conservation, as well as high levels of undocumented immigration and border security, all in this one area. And so just to give a little bit of history of the refuge, Cabeza Prieta was originally a game refuge for hunting of bighorn sheep. So it was created in 1939. And if you'll see just to the north of the refuge is the Barry M. Goldwater Range. And this is an Air Force training range. And historically, When the Air Force was training, they would use the land in the range, but they also used the airspace above Cabeza Prieta. In 1966, the area became a United States Fish and Wildlife Service, or a National Wildlife Refuge. And really interesting, there is an amazing history of collaboration for endangered species management in this area. And the Air Force really worked closely with Arizona Fish and Game and with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to promote species conservation. And so I'm going to move forward, or Emily, could you move forward to the next slide? And so this collaborative conservation went on for many years. And in the 1990s, a couple of things changed dramatically in this area. And I have a slightly different map than Jody, but you'll see a similar theme that there are lots of different federally protected lands in Arizona. And you can see I've got a square around Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, and it's a part of a larger conglomeration of federal lands. In the 1990s, things began to change dramatically for Cabeza Prieta. And there were two things that happened kind of simultaneously. One was that US immigration policy changed, and the United States Border Patrol created a policy called prevention through deterrence. It's kind of a mouthful, but the basic idea was that they were going to stop undocumented immigration through urban areas and funnel it through desert areas. And the rationale behind this was that they would make it so difficult for people to cross through the desert that numbers of undocumented immigrants would decline. And so when that policy was enacted, Cabeza Prieta really took the brunt of this new change in how people were entering the United States and how smugglers were bringing things into the United States. And Cabeza Prieta became very, very busy. And in a response to that, the US Border Patrol and later, after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security built up a really massive, something similar to a militarized border, although it's really important to distinguish that, that the Department of Homeland Security is different than the US Armed Forces. Make sure I'm okay on my time here. And the other thing that happened simultaneously in the 1990s was the Arizona Desert Wilderness Act. And so we saw this land really shift, and there became these sort of polarizing forces. One was the act of wilderness creation and protecting wilderness, and then the other was the rise in the traffic and the flow of people, as well as the response by Department of Homeland Security. And if you can shift to the next slide, Emily, I'll just talk about a couple of challenges, contemporary challenges to conservation in this area that are relevant, I think, to some of the topics that our other presenters referred to. So Cabeza Prieta is a wilderness protected area, but as I mentioned, it has an incredible amount of traffic. So I have a couple of images here. On the one hand, there is the challenge of garbage and a litter that's left behind from migrants and smugglers. And that first picture is it's a pickup site where human smugglers, after people cross the border, then the smugglers come and pick up people, and so they leave things behind. The second picture is Border Patrol dragging tires, and this is a common practice. And they do that so that they can smooth the dirt, so they can see footprints and try to track down undocumented immigrants and smugglers. Obviously, that has a huge environmental impact and is incredibly destructive and is really counter to what should be happening in a wilderness area. And then my last image is of the Sonoran pronghorn. So while Cabeza Prieta was originally created for hunting a bighorn sheep, it primarily shifted to restoration of Sonoran pronghorn habitat. Sonoran pronghorn are a subspecies of pronghorn, and they have been really decimated, especially because of the border And so pronghorn are not great jumpers. They're kind of skittish around fences. And so as the border has been developed and as roads and highways have crossed the area, it's really fragmented Sonoran habitat. Today, there are fewer than 500 Sonoran pronghorn, and they're split between the United States and Mexico. So some interesting connections with Rocky's presentation. Cabeza Prieta focuses on a captive breeding program and trying to reestablish those populations. So that's a really brief overview into a really complicated situation, but I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And our final presenter today is Dr. Matt Williamson, who is a conservation scientist, also here in the Human and Environmental Systems unit at Boise State University. And he's interested in understanding the relations between people, the environment, and institutions that inspire or at times inhibit conservation action and how that influences effectiveness. So he's interested in integrating theories from social psychology and public policy, and also landscape ecology with a diverse range of data sets to develop spatial models for conservation action. Okay, so will I be sharing your slides, Matt? I think, is that the?
I think you're gonna have to, it looks like.
Great, okay.
It would appear that 8 months of running Zoom nonstop has destroyed the computer I had hoped to use for this call.
Well, I think your slides are up and we can hear you, so.
Can you go up one, I think, maybe? Or is that the only one that came through to you?
Is that the first one, the buffalo?
Aha. So, speaking of animals that don't jump well, I'm going to talk a little bit today about different sort of habitat fragmentation and try and use the example of the American Plains buffalo to illustrate the challenges that come from having all of these different jurisdictions smashed up against an international border. So, Emily, if you could move to the next slide. So just to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page, once we are on the same page, I want to define a few things. So one of the things we've talked about a bit about, and Rocky mentions this, and Lisa also mentioned this, is just this notion of fragmentation, the idea that we are increasingly dividing large patches of habitat for lots of species into smaller and increasingly isolated patches. And this has sort of been, since the early 90s, a key driver of most of our conservation concerns in the US and globally. One strategy for overcoming the impacts of fragmentation has been to focus on increasing connectivity between those patches. And so when I say connectivity, I don't mean the terrible version that my computer is having, but rather the degree to which a landscape might facilitate, in this case, wildlife's movement. And we might care about those things because it allows an individual of a species to either access additional resources, find mates to reproduce successfully, and increasingly to avoid the impacts of climate change. And I think as we sort of think about the number of north to south migrations and low to high migrations that we're going to see in the coming decades, this international border issue that we've been discussing becomes increasingly important there. So what you see here is sort of our typical approach for conserving connectivity. We find a couple big patches. We try to identify the easiest way to get between those two patches, and then we do some version of habitat restoration, or in the case of what's happening here, a fairly extreme investment of creating overpasses specifically to help wildlife get across those barriers. Emily, you can go to the next slide, please. But what I'd like to do today is make an argument that in addition to roads or mountains or the sorts of things that we usually think about making it hard for wildlife to move, there's an additional set of components of the landscape that make it difficult for us to conserve those movements. And so one part of that might come from our different social preferences. So we might have different attitudes towards different species. Our communities may respond differently to different species. This is certainly true for bison when we think about the agricultural community's concern of disease spread versus a number of the tribal communities' belief that bison is a relative. We also tend to see policy preferences that are consistent across different issues. So if you don't like the federal government working with healthcare, you probably don't like them working with wildlife, and so that may drive how you choose to respond to different conservation efforts. Economically, we might think about things like regulatory impact as we restrict land uses to promote movement. We might worry about actual mortality. So when predators take out livestock, that has a cost. We might also worry about these indirect sorts of things where the perception that there might be an increase in disease risk creates a limitation for market access. This again is something that's showing up a lot in the debate about bison, where brucellosis or the fear of brucellosis has ranchers in Montana and North Dakota quite concerned about what that will mean for their access to markets. And finally, and something I'd like to focus on a bit more here, is the institutional component. And when I say the institutional component, I mean, does the agency or the entity that's supposed to be managing these things actually have the authority to do that? It turns out for species like wildlife, that's a bit of a tricky proposition. Do they have the capacity in terms of resources, both human and financial, to actually implement any of the plans that they come up with? And then lastly, are there political incentives? So in the case of the bison, we might think about something like the Department of Interior's I think almost 10-year now Bison Conservation Initiative that creates some incentive for the agencies within the Department of Interior to align their management plans with that broader secretarial order, but that doesn't extend across to, say, something like the Department of Agriculture in the U.S. Next slide, Emily. And so just to sort of maybe ground this a little bit for you in the case of the buffalo, I've been thinking about this mostly in Montana, North Dakota, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And so one of the more interesting things is that as you cross each of those state lines or provincial lines, you get a different designation. So in Alberta, the free-ranging bison is considered extirpated, so it doesn't exist, despite the fact that there are some in Banff National Park and a few other places. And so any buffalo that exist in Alberta are considered livestock. If you move over to Saskatchewan, they're considered wildlife and actually considered an S1 species, so a fairly sensitive species and one that there are some active efforts to conserve. In Montana, they can be considered wildlife or livestock, and the same in North Dakota. And so you can see that depending on how they're classified, you might get a different agency whose job it is to manage those species. You also get a different set of mandates in terms of, if I am managing wildlife from the Department of Agriculture standpoint, I probably have a different set of concerns than I would if I was, say, the National Park Service or Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan. I didn't show the patchwork of jurisdictions here that has shown up in almost all of these presentations, because I think it's sufficient to say that in Western Montana, we have a fair preponderance of federal land, and so there are opportunities at the federal level to sort of harmonize those things. As we move on to some of the Native American reservations in the U.S. and First Nation reserves in Canada, you get sort of a different mix of governance approaches. And then as you move further east into Saskatchewan and northwestern North Dakota, it's almost entirely private land. And so depending on where you are geographically within that bison range, the alignment of different mandates and constituencies to whom you're responsive changes pretty substantially. Similarly, on the west edge of that landscape, bison are a big draw for tourism within the national parks. As you move east, they actually become at least perceived as a fairly large threat to livestock husbandry and agriculture. So if we could go to the next slide. So then what might we do? Well, one of the things that's been relatively successful in terms of navigating that international border as well as different jurisdictions have been these sort of collaborative governance, network governance style regimes. So the Crown Managers Partnership is a group of land managers both from Alberta and from the US and Montana that are working together in the Crown Waterton, or in the Glacier Waterton National Park area. The ENI initiative is a Native American First Nation led effort to return bison to the historical landscape of the Blackfoot Confederacy with partners from NGOs, the National Park Service, and then US and Canadian government agencies. So that's one option. The challenge there being that those things tend to run short of resources. Different capacities amongst the different partners can create power vacuums or power imbalances. And if there isn't a long-term vision for funding or support, it's not actually clear how you maintain those things going forward. It's also not clear how you ensure that the various jurisdictions respond to the needs of the network. Secondly, you might think about something like federal policy. So in Canada, which is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, they have this pathway to Canada's Target 1 as part of the broader Aichi targets. Part of that has been an emphasis on connectivity and finding ways to improve or restore connectivity. In the US, I think it might be back on the House floor right now. There's a Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. These are efforts designed to recognize wildlife connectivity as an important objective for management in this country. They create a number of different coordinating boards, et cetera, but in the end, they solve the problem of jurisdictional complexity by introducing yet another jurisdiction. And so the last piece that I might suggest and sort of could be an interesting route is the idea of a treaty. So one of the benefits coming out of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was that it allowed the federal government to sort of harmonize the various state regulations in the US, and the federal government in Canada harmonize the provincial regulations in Canada as a means of trying to get sort of a singular management focus. It also created or emphasized a single entity as being responsible for implementing the responsibilities under that treaty, and also came along with some accountability mechanisms. And so while treaties can be extremely hard to actually get ratified, they may solve a number of these different sort of operational challenges. Next slide, Emily. And I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is the idea that there actually is a treaty in place. It's called the Buffalo Treaty. It was signed, I think, 10 years ago yesterday. It's an agreement amongst a number of Native American tribes in the US, First Nations in Canada, to try and restore both the ecological and cultural importance of bison across much of its original range. This effort is still ongoing, and there are opportunities for both Canadian and federal entities to become signatories, but it could do a fairly significant amount to overcome the fragmentation brought on by the multiple jurisdictions in this landscape. With that, I will turn it back over to Emily and hope my computer doesn't die.
Thank you, Matt. Let me ask all of the panelists to go ahead and turn their webcams back on, and we will try and have a conversation through the screen this way. We are having some great questions coming in, and please join me in thanking the panelists for the great talks that they delivered that were very provocative on a number of the themes we laid out in the front, and I think some other ideas that are coming in as well. There seems to be audience interest in the idea of successful conservation collaborations across tribal and non-tribal borders within the US. And I was wondering if any of our panelists had a model or an example of a successful collaboration across those borders that they would be willing to share.
I shut off my webcam because I think it's going to kill my computer, but I guess I would say that I think the jury is still out, but it would appear that at least part of the ENI initiative suggests that between the Park Service and Glacier National Park specifically, and the Blackfeet on the US side of the border are approaching some success there. I think it's still pretty early to say whether all of the parties' objectives will be met, but there's certainly reasons to be hopeful.
Anyone else have an example to offer?
I don't have an example as much as a comment. I think it's interesting, Matt pointed out, thinking about treaties or international treaties as a solution to fragmented endangered species protection. And I think that we're seeing such a sort of rollback at the federal level in terms of participation in treaties and international agreements, that we will have to look to the tribal nations and possibly even like interstate. We've seen like a rise in cities signing on to climate change treaties. And so maybe some of that sort of collaboration will have to happen in non-federal ways, at least for, you know, the near future, as we've seen such a rollback of participation.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that it's unlikely that the federal government is going to be leading in the space of multinational agreements anytime soon, but there certainly have been some really innovative partnerships at a more local level, and potentially those could be more durable if we believe that those things, if they have enough resources to sustain themselves.
This is Rocky. I was just going to say that one of the treaties that's going to be really critical for a whole lot of species in the Pacific Northwest is the Columbia Treaty. That is they're negotiating it now. They're updating it. I can't remember the date. It's either either 2022 or 2024 that it's supposed to be finished. And the tribes have really taken the lead in pushing that the priorities change in that treaty to ecosystem services rather than simply power production. And so far, I don't know what's going on in those talks. Idaho has kind of said, no, don't do that. We want, our interests to stay at the top. But it's going to be interesting to watch that over the next couple of years, because that could change a whole lot of species management programs.
Absolutely. Another commonality of all of the talks is the charismatic species that appear in each of them, right? On face value, they were immediately about endangered species, right? Or the role of these animals in the landscape. But we had the caribou and the northern and the southern pronghorn and the buffalo. And I'm curious if the panelists could speak a little bit to the larger implications of perhaps shifting conservation away from animals into more targeted relationships, maybe like some of those that Jody suggested, among private and public land agencies, or for particular pieces of landscapes like the mesic areas, rather than away from some of these charismatic animals. Or are the charismatic animals here to stay, to drive that policy and make those agreements?
Well, I'll weigh in. I think part of our challenge here, it's like the caribou. Is anything going to happen about caribou? Well, not unless people care. And people care about charismatic species. So, that drives so much in conservation is our, people caring about species. It was ironic. Lots of people cared about wolves. And what a great success story that we've had in bringing wolves both down the U.S. and, of course, come back in British Columbia. But it came at the expense of caribou. And so, I think you have to really look at the habitat really kind of at the base. And then you say, what are we need you need collaboration. I think the caribou one was a great example that when they needed the people on the ground, they didn't have people on the ground in the areas advocating for them, and we need that. we need that, and we also need that wet habitat that private property owners provide. I mean, that's, you know, so it's all important, but we've got to have, you know, we've got to have a plan that kind of pushes both of those interests, as Jody was saying, and kind of take a look at you know, outcome-based management for particularly on the private lands. You know, we can't just force them to do what they need to do for these charismatic species, you know, but we can say, here's what these species need. Can you find a way to manage around that?
Other panelists have ideas on that one?
I guess the only thing, I think one of the interesting parts of this Wildlife Corridor Conservation Act actually is the inclusion of a fairly significant amount of resources to do sort of what Rocky was just suggesting, which is to say, if these are the things we need, here are some incentive structures, incentive packages that we might be able to use to better align private land management with some of the wildlife objectives.
Excellent. There's another question coming in. In Northwest Montana, the agency I work for, this viewer says, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, is focused on partnering with organizations like the Trust for Public Land and private landowners to secure conservation easements on large tracts of land, mostly corporate timberland. To date, over 200,000 acres have been protected from development, and another 230,000 are currently targeted for protection. This seems to ensure conservation value while also maintaining private land ownership. It garners more public support because it doesn't fit the perception that government is taking over the land. Could any of our panelists speak a little to this idea of conservation easements and its implementation?
I can speak to what my interactions with the public in Idaho, both in rural parts of Idaho and here in the Boise metropolitan area. And I guess what I have found is that by and large, agricultural easements are something, and I'm mostly focused on agricultural easements, but by and large, it's something that the majority of people have support for, you know, ranchers and farmers and across the political spectrum. Now, land use zoning as a way to do land use management, that is something that definitely does not have widespread support, but conservation easements are more seen, agricultural easements are more seen as a voluntary thing that people can opt into or not opt into. Typically, the farmer or the rancher, they do receive money, not necessarily all the way up to market value, but they do receive some financial benefit. That could also be in the form of like a tax break. So just generally speaking, easements, in my experience, are something that a lot of ranchers and farmers support. I think the major obstacle to their widespread implementation is, since farmers or ranchers do receive money for, you know, signing away their rights to develop that land into perpetuity, it's expensive, you know. So if you think of one farmer owns 500 acres and on the market, 500 acres, you know, in the Boise area, 1 acre is maybe $50,000. So you do the math, just even to protect a relatively small parcel of land, that adds up really quickly. So land use zoning, that doesn't cost anything. You just say you can or cannot build here. So I would say easements are one tool in the toolbox, and we should definitely consider it. And it seems like in this person's case, it's been very successful. But I don't think it can be the only tool in the toolbox, just because you would just need so much money to protect enough. In a typical landscape, you would need too much money, more money than is out there to protect what you need to protect.
Excellent, thank you. We'll take a last question here, which is about the National Outdoors Act that has just passed and that permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And the viewer is asking how this will promote wildlife connectivity, especially in the West, and in regards to private land conservation as well. And they are asking, are there certain wildlife corridors that will get a boost because of this legislation? Do any of you have any insights into the changes that that come through with that act?
Yeah, I think that there's clearly, the people who've been working on this for the last decade have been focusing on some areas. And so the agencies that have been, they've been going back and forth with, they've been identifying tracts of land and places. And I think it's true that we can't, we don't have enough money, and there's not going to, and it's as much money as this is going to be, it's going to be a lot more money than's been available. So I'll give you one of the examples is the Great Divide that we saw Lemhi County in one of the slides. That Great Divide area, at the moment, there is it's the collaborative process there is kind of broken down because of some folks over on the right. And so I do think that there's probably some ranchers who are all ready to do some easements if there's some money available. And I think there's going to be some money available in the next couple of years for that, right out of that funding. And so that's, and I'm sure there's places like that in Montana and down south as well. But these have been kind of on the list for a while, and maybe kind of what you would say is maybe right beyond what anybody thought was going to be available anytime soon to now it's there. So that's where I see.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think I agree with the idea that there's probably already been a shortlist for the last 10 years. I think part of my thoughts on this come back to the question about easements as well, and that is that there are big parts of the West where property rights are a concern, and so the notion that we could use LWCF funds as a means of enhancing the federal estate, whether that's true or not, creates some additional conflict that I think it's not entirely clear how that will play out, especially as things become more and more polarized. But one of the things that I think it does create an opportunity for is a much more interesting conversation about new kinds of mechanisms and institutions that might allow for using those resources to achieve the objectives we want, but maybe through a different set of tools and policies than we had in the past.
That echoes nicely in the points about authority and capacity building and collaborative governance and rethinking those pieces. I'd like to, on behalf of the Andrews Center and Boise State University, thank the panelists again for their wonderful presentations and this great conversation with our audience. We appreciate you taking the time to think through these issues with us, and we appreciate also your insight in the questions and anecdotes that you've presented. You can get in touch with any of us through the Boise State website, and I believe I will turn it over to Dominique, who has a final announcement about the next panel talk that's in this series.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all the panelists for such an interesting conversation. Just wanted to let you know we do have an upcoming webinar next 2 Wednesdays from now, the October 14th, again, same time, 12 o'clock Mountain Time. We will be talking about carbon sequestration and climate justice in cities. And this next webinar will be hosted by us, the Salazar Center at Colorado State University. And you can register for it as well as learn about other upcoming webinars in the Conservation Conversations series at conservationconversations.org. Quite the mouthful. To all the panelists and Emily, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll send out the link here to the recording in the next few days, and have a wonderful afternoon.